And we are live with the Mattriarchy. Sorry, I'm a little discombobulated today. I am, of course, Matt Rhys, and joining me in our first hour is Cross Comics. Rick, there, how you doing?
I am doing well.
Yeah,
And yourself?
and excellent. And we are going to be talking about the Canadian Shield. We also have for the second hour, who has come a little early, but that's okay. In fact, it's great. Captain Cummings will be joining us second hour to talk about Frederic Wertham and all the nefarious dealings of comic history there. So, Captain, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Very cool.
Good to see you again, Captain Cummings.
And anyway, and Rick from Cross Comics, I don't know if you heard, he's here as well. So we did have one before we get started, Rick. We did have one question from the chat first off, which is a fellow Flying Saucer asked if Gary Shipman is doing a cover or something because he was doing giving away a Canadian Shield sketch yesterday.
No, he's not doing a cover to my knowledge. He hasn't said anything. I only saw part of that show. I guess he was doing something to try and promote my book, to try and get up there. We are acquaintances, friends. I'm not sure what. I've been on his show a few times. He's been on mine a couple. So we're developing friendship. So
yeah, internet friendships are kind of weird because you can see a person's thoughts and you can talk to them even, but it's not quite the same as sitting down across a table or any of that kind of stuff. So I know I've got some buddies that I've even made art with over the last dozen years or whatever, that we've worked on comic projects and talked about our families, but it's still sort of like, well, I call them a friend, but if I was stranded in DC and they were 2 towns over, I'm not sure they'd help me. So, we're getting going here. Rick, go ahead and tell us about the Canadian Shield. What was your inspiration to create this character?
My biggest inspiration was God. I got into comics when I was, I'm not sure what age, probably around 15. I had watched Super Friends and all that growing up, the 80s cartoons, 70s cartoons. And I got into reading Christian Archies. That's how I got into comics. That led into mainstream Archies, which led into DC and Marvel around, the time of Superman dying. And I had decided, there's like no Christian comic books out there, especially ongoing stuff with superheroes. And I decided to create my own. And he wasn't one of my first characters, but I probably thought of him within the first 2 or 3 years, I think. He was radically different when I first created him, but he's, for lack of a better word, evolved into what we have now.
Very cool. Very cool. So tell us a little bit about who he is and what makes him, stand out.
Well, he is a Native American from the early 1800s. He's been transported through time to our present, and by God, and he's been given a suit from the future that gives him powers beyond those of mortal men, making him like a virtual Superman. So he in himself doesn't have the powers, but the suit gives him the powers of flight, invulnerability, speed, probably an array of other stuff, super senses, sight, smell, taste, all that sort of stuff. And he is a Christian as well. So yeah, he's a man out of time, a Christian from back then, which would have been unusual for a Native American back then, being a Christian.
Very cool stuff. So my question here, so the time travel element is different from a lot of. I mean, time travel isn't unique within comics, of course, but it's not something that's used a lot. What was your decision to use the time travel angle?
I think at the time I was thinking I wanted somebody that, and I haven't done it in the comics that I've written too much of him, but I wanted somebody to be able to reflect on the change in culture from, the early 1800s to the modern day. Modern day when I created him was the 90s. Now it's like 30 years later, and it's even stranger than it would have been then. In the 90s. So, and I'd like to get that in there eventually. But that was one of the reasons for the time travel.
One of the things I think is really interesting about that idea too is, I guess one of my favorite characters is Captain America. But part of that is looking at his, the whole man at a time thing from a closer perspective. But I really also like the other side of his story, which is Nick Fury's, right? Where somebody who lived through all of the change. When you approached, 100, almost 200 years of difference in the Canadian Shield's experience, how did you look at his view of the modern world?
I haven't quite, like I said, I haven't quite explored it in my comics yet. When he's transported to our time, he's not transported to a metropolitan area, so he's getting used to it. He's got to delve, probably delve into it eventually really deep because, I'm not sure how to put it, he's in a major city of the time, but, a major city now, there's so much difference. You just don't want the culture shock,
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be enough culture shock as he finds out how society has changed and rules and all that. Some things for the good, some things for the negative.
All right. Okay. And the other question is plot wise, the suit from the future. Where did that kind of come from?
Well, I had to give him some way of getting powers, and I could have probably said some secret government laboratory nowadays, but I wanted to, I didn't think we'd have it, especially back in the 90s. I didn't think any secret government laboratory would have anything to this extent. So I figured, why not the future? Heck, I think at one time I thought, the year 2025, well, that's going to be even put off further, like maybe 2050, 2070 or whatever it's supposed to be from. Suit, because things have changed. We're so close to 2025.
Yeah. No, I'm not. I'm very similar. I'm not sure what our difference in age is, but I'm almost 42. But I know I created my first superhero universe back in the 90s too, and it was also a Christian-based universe as well. I kind of set that on the shelf to work on some other stuff through the years, but I also know what you're talking about, having been crafting ideas and working on stuff since the 90s, to then find yourself in 2020 and all of a sudden, man, life sure goes fast.
Yes,
and all the stuff that I remember growing up as a kid in the 80s, and they'd have all their deep future stories set like 2025, and that's like 4 years from now. So
heck, just think, we're past Back to the future.
Yeah, and next year's Blade Runner. So that's
it's just crazy. And then even the ones from the 50s and that, we're way past those.
Oh yeah.
What is it? Star Trek. We're past the eugenics war in that.
Well, and the space 1999, and 1999 was nothing like that.
Yeah.
So, but back to the thing. So, let's talk a little bit about the production. You've been working with these characters in your mind since the 90s, and this particular comic. How many pages are we looking at?
It is 24.
24 pages, so standard comic size. And so, is it all done, or how far along are you?
It's all drawn up. It's in the middle being colored by Pope Raven.
Okay.
If you know who Pope Raven is, somebody within the community.
Very cool. Very cool. And are you going to be doing the lettering yourself?
It's either going to be me or Pope Lettering. Pope Raven.
Like,
Raven wanted a chance at it, so
there's a separate Pope for lettering. Man, I wish I'd known that. I was on Douglas Ernst's channel last night talking about Catholicism. I could have asked.
Oh.
Yeah, but yeah, so that's cool. That's cool. And so you guys are looking to now you're funding right now.
Yeah.
And the production is supposed to wrap up soon. What time are you guys looking to fulfill on that?
I have put July of this year. I'm hoping it'll be sooner. Like I said, the biggest concern right now for me is the coloring. I don't think lettering should take that long. Mm-hmm. I know, I don't mean any disrespect to letterers, and I know everybody says you need, there's an art to it, and I agree there's a bit of an art to it, but I wouldn't say quite as much as, the drawing or whatever. It's just getting the bubble placed in the bubble or the square box placed in the right spot. I did do a version of the comic before, and it was available for the longest time on my website for like $2.50, but that is no longer available. I did everything on that, but I took, I revamped it, redid the drawings. John Dillard beefed up my inks a little. And I wanted to revamp it because, I had drawn it like 10 years ago. So it's, I've come a long way since then. So I started in September. I started drawing the first issue on my channel, and I got finished down about end of November.
So do you have a big story involved and an idea of that? That's got the whole works in there, like a big epic tale, or are you thinking like episodes, or how many do you have thought about, or what's your long-term plan for the Canadian Shield?
Well, my universe is meant to be like DC or Marvel's ongoing comics books monthly basis. Whether I'm going to be able to do that right at the start like I would have wanted, I don't think so. But like I've got 8 scripts written for him already, and I have an idea of what I'm doing for up to like issue 18, 19. Your volume went out, Matt.
No, I just hadn't said anything.
I know what's wrong. I'm looking at you on YouTube.
So, okay.
And your mouses were moving, and there's no words coming out.
I may have been reading. That might have happened. I don't know. Can you guys out in the chat, if I've dipped out, let me know. But actually, it looks like I'm not sure. I
hear you behind the scenes here, but
Well, I'm going to keep talking and pretend that everything's okay, and then let's see. 30 seconds later, the chat can tell me if I'm right. So, so that's actually quite a bit of material that you've got going on there, and I know you have a whole universe of heroes and characters.
Yeah.
Had you have your eye on the next project already? I mean, I know you're not quite fulfilled with this one, but
yeah. Like I said, I'm in the middle of drawing up number 2 on my channel, and the next Indiegogo that I'm going to do, as long as this funds, which I'm believing it will be the Canadian Shield number 2 and Snowdrift number 1. That's my next character, and I have 8 scripts of her written already.
Okay. Very cool.
Cool. I have a nice plan, and then like I have another character called the Flame. I've got 12 scripts of him written already, so I've got like 7 major characters that I want to bring out, and after about a year and a half of them being out, all of them, they're going to form a team.
Good. I think I love the superhero team, and I like the fact that you're taking some time and building that. I am going to take a break from questions just for a second, though, to address some stuff in the chat. Thank you guys for getting back to me. And yes, Sprited, I do have a new microphone. It says it's red, but it's actually kind of purple. But that's okay because it works, right? So I had several people tell me I needed a mic adamantly and started sending me adverts for it. So I picked one. But yeah. So now one of the things is, of course, your hero is Canadian themed. Was there, other than yourself being Canadian, was there any particular reason that you decided to make him Canadian?
No, that's basically it. Because I'm Canadian. They say write what you know. So,
and so how does his Canadian nationality how has that affected or changed the way you have chosen to tell the story?
I don't think it's affected it much at this point. Like I said, I've got the first 8 issues written. He's on the journey to getting where he needs to go. Like I said, originally he was from the Hamilton area where I live back in his time, and he's transported somewhere far away from there in the present day. But he's gonna slowly come back to where Hamilton is in present day. Well, be in the same spot. And I'll probably be dealing with a lot more once he's settled in Hamilton on politicalness. But in one of the issues, he names himself Canadian Shield mainly because the outfit, somebody he ends up traveling with says your suit looks like a Canadian flag, and like you're a protector of Canada, so why not call yourself the Canadian Shield? I'm paraphrasing how the conversation goes. So that's really how the name comes about, and it's not like till the 4th or 5th issue he actually gets the name Canadian Shield.
Well, in the chat, the Metal says Canada isn't even a real place. Don't let Rick trick you. I don't believe you, Metal. I don't believe you at all. But out of curiosity, now I don't really know a lot about Canadian geography. So the part you're at, you said is near Hamilton. Whereabouts is that?
Well, I live in Hamilton, and Hamilton is about an hour's drive from Toronto, if you know where that is.
Okay.
We're about an hour southwest.
So that's that's across the lake from Michigan,
Toronto.
Right?
We're on Lake Ontario, right on the thing. So. In fact, on a clear day from Hamilton, on a very clear day in good eyesight, you can actually see the CN Tower.
Okay. So cool. That tells me a lot about that. I am from West Nebraska, and which is actually far from. Well, it's not terribly far from Canada, but it'd take about a day to drive there if you're taking your time. But.
Yeah. And actually, where I got the name, the Canadian Shield, there's a geographical formation in Canada that we call the Canadian Shield. That's actually
really?
That's where I pulled the name from.
The Metal just mentioned that. What is the geographic feature?
It's actually here in the province of Ontario. I'm not sure exactly where it is. I know it's in northern Ontario, and it goes around Hudson Bay.
Okay.
And I think it also maybe goes into Quebec. Can't be sure. Haven't studied it too much. I just know about it. Heck, at one time, a lot of people ask, that he doesn't actually have a shield. At one time, I thought of giving him a shield in that format, looking like the design of the formation too, but I scrapped that idea.
Yeah, that would probably seem a little too derivative, even though it has its own origin. It would probably still seem like too Captain America about that.
Yeah.
So, this is kind of a shame though, because that seems like a natural fit.
Yeah.
So in the chat, we have Captain Cummings actually said, I hear Canada's healthcare system is just doctors issuing beer and maple syrup to some children.
Not quite.
That's
We
not
get a
true.
little bit more than that.
I hear stories that hasn't always been great, but I don't think it's quite that good. Quite that to that level. I mean, and also Sprited said that it's all a cover up. Have you actually seen a Canadian? I have actually. I used to work with a youth pastor whose entire family was Canadian, and his mom was from the north, and she came down here and married a fellow, and brought. There was a blended family of 3 Americans and 4 Canadians. So I know a whole passel of Canadians.
And to that person, you've now seen a Canadian.
So I have seen them Sprited. They're real. They're just a lot like us. They're just not the same. So slightly more Mackenzies, I think, but you know, they're still real. But
Yeah. Not like
Yeah.
Australia.
well, I got to be careful. Sometimes Rhys watches my show. I say the wrong thing, and I never know what'll come in the post.
Oh, right, he knows me. He knows. he's been on my panel before, so
Yeah,
we're friends,
he's
acquaintances, whatever whatever you
he's
want
a
to call
good
it.
guy, but he's a real
Yeah.
spitfire. So.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to just keep derailing things off the comic there, Rick, but
No,
Spridey
no.
so in the chat he says I've dated a Canadian and I'm not even convinced she's real. I think
That's no problem getting off the comic. We'll go back on and on. It's about it's also about these guys getting to know me, knowing I'm a good guy, and something that they want to buy, the Canadian Shield buy into. It's definitely worth it. You're buying into not just a character but a universe.
So because I have you on to talk about it, I would like to take some time to actually look at the campaign itself. So let me look that up, and then we can go ahead and check that out here just a second. I've got to click a few buttons. While I am doing that, I was going to try to say something, but unfortunately my brain locked up on me while I was trying to share my screen. So isn't that something funny? So hey, there we go. Look at that, the Indiegogo page, and my mountain of tabs. So just ignore that, everybody in the chat there.
I think we can do that.
So Canadian Shield issue number 1.
Yeah.
And you're looking at $2,000 as a goal, which is I think pretty reasonable at this point. You're 60% funded. You've got 16 days left. That's so that'll be like second week in March, yeah?
The 7th of March at 11:59 Pacific Standard Time.
Okay, so that's that second Sunday then.
Yeah.
So
it's like 3 in the morning for me, so.
So, yeah.
And I'll probably stream till the last second as it goes out and put it in. Hopefully, be able to put it in demand.
And so it looks like you've got 2 different covers that are available.
Yeah, one done by me, which is the one you're looking at there, and then one done by John Dillard, which is also what I have on a poster that he made when I was at a Hamilton Comic Con, although I didn't get them in time. So.
Okay, very cool looking, and the lighting effect on John's poster is real fun. That's for sure.
Yeah, John's is excellent.
So
mine's pretty good, but John's is definitely better.
So, and so you've got the digital at $50, and that's just your 5. I keep saying the wrong thing. $5, Matthew. And so then you also have here this featured perk, which is the double dealing plus the ash can. What do we get in this package?
You get both covers, as well as John's ashcan that he's drawing of his character, the buckler.
Okay. Okay. And for those of you who may not know or tune in later, a buckler is, of course, a small shield specifically meant to defend oneself against arrows. So small and round. But yeah, so that's the 3 books there for $45. You can get just the buckler ashcan for $10.
Yeah, you can get it just by itself.
And how is that? Is that going to be like a full size ashcan, or what's the?
It was supposed to be 8 pages, but he's bumped it up to 14.
Oh, okay, cool. Good,
and I can't change that number because once somebody buys it, you can't change that sort of stuff. So I'm just gonna tell people, and so they're getting an even better deal with it. Being 14 pages, although it'll probably end up be 14 pages of story and 2 pages of whatever else plus cover stuff.
Right, because you got to have something with that. So and with that, are you guys doing the old school punk rock style ashcan? Just photocopy that, or what's the plan for it?
No, I'm gonna get that printed up.
You print it up, okay? So just to be like a digest.
John's gonna send me. He's doing all the inks and all that. He's gonna put together, and then send it all pages to me, and I will get it all printed up, and everybody will get it with their. Well, if they get just the ashcan, they'll get that sent out. But if they get it with their books, it will be sent with their books.
Okay. So for the love of Canada, the $20 level there, and he gets just one unsigned. And is it a choice of covers?
Yeah, your choice of cover. Once you click the perk, you can select which one you want to get. Mine or John's. Okay. That's why our names are underneath them.
Right.
Just to make.
Tells you which one you want when you're, picking out. And I'm assuming the $25 level then is the signed copy, yeah?
Yeah, and again, your choice of cover.
So.
And right now, I've actually got a contest going on until the end of the month for people to do their own version of the Canadian Shield, tell about powers and a little bit of history. And whoever, and like first Monday in March, they've got to like the 29th to get it in. And the first Monday in March, I'm going to have on my show, I'm going to have a straw poll, put everybody's in, get it voted on. And whoever wins, their version is going to be made into a trading card and given to each of the, perks that are, physical perk.
Oh, cool. That's always fun. I love trading cards. when I was coming up as a young fellow, they had the DC Cosmic cards and the Marvel cards, and I just loved those. I still have a bunch actually. So whenever anybody, I was so cool that when on the Earthworm Jim campaign, when Doug TenNapel did the big set of cards, I didn't have the scratch to get very many. I just got the ones that came with the book. But man, it was exciting to get those little open the foil packages and everything. It was a blast from the past for sure. So, the signed comic plus the ashcan on the $30 level.
Yeah, so you save $5 on the ashcan when getting that one.
So, and is that now that ships from Canada, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing. Shipping on all these is included or free, however you want to put it.
Okay.
So what the price you see, $30 American, that's what you pay.
Okay, that's a shipping included is actually a big deal because I've gotten stuff from Canada and sometimes it's not cheap. So, and here of course you get one of each cover signed. Wow.
Yeah, that's just like the featured perk, but without the ashcan.
I see. Okay.
It was for a while my first featured perk till I put the ashcan in. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a bit sketchy. So both covers signed, plus a 12x18 sketch
of a cross comics character of your choice. As you see, my website's there. They can go there, and under the character section, there's heroes, villains, a couple angels, a couple demons, supporting cast. They can choose which character they want, and I'll draw it up on That it's a 12 by 18, 140-pound watercolor cold press paper.
Okay, very cool. So you have a level called the Lorenzo?
I'm not sure whether you know who Lorenzo Sleestack is.
Right, he comes on every once and again to hang out.
Yeah, well, anyways, he was wanting to be able to get, two of each cover and two of the ash can, So instead of just making it a secret perk and giving it to him, I figured, why not just put it up in case anybody wants double? and you save $5, and I figured, why not just call it the Lorenzo?
And somebody picked it up too. So
well, Lorenzo picked it.
Yeah, at that point, you'd kind of have to, right? So, passion for art. I'm guessing this has one of the pages.
Yeah, you get both covers signed, and you get a page of the art. There's only 10 of those to be claimed because of a later perk that we'll get to in a couple seconds.
Okay. The Canadian Shield figurine. Oh, that's a cool one.
Yeah. Again, both covers signed, and you get about an 8-inch high figurine by 5 wide, 4 deep, and so and again, shipping included. And all these perks, most of the perks, or I should say, all the perks that don't have an ash can, like this one doesn't say it comes with an ash can, but I've got so you can add the ash can on for $5.
I hit the wrong thing. I was trying to highlight that it said free shipping, and it was just like, oh, you want free shipping? And I was like, hey, hang on, man. I'm just scoping it out. Okay.
And of course, there is the.
So I was going to ask, what's your process for getting the figurine made, though?
Pardon?
What's your process for getting the figurine made?
I'm not sure whether you know who George Peter Gatsas is.
Okay, I haven't met him, no.
Well, he did the book Joe King. Anyways, he offered to do up the 3D model, and he's got a 3D printer, so cool. He will be printing them off as ordered.
Oh, very cool, very fun. So, this is the big dog right here. So.
Yeah.
Both covers, the sketch, an original page of art, a figurine, and the ash can, huh?
But the special part of this is I will come and hand deliver it to you.
Wow. There you go. Deliver to your door.
Yeah, I will get on the bus, the plane, whatever, and I will come to you. Although it is limited to Canada and the States.
Right.
Eventually I might do the international tier further than that, but not than that, although it might end up being more money. It might be like $2,000,
right? Because you've got to fly to Japan, it's going to cost you something.
Yeah.
So, well, that's quite the thing. I love that you've worked shipping into it. That's one of the things that is I don't know, it's hard to come by sometimes, and I think some people don't think about stuff like that. So.
Well, as a
oh goodness sakes. I hit the wrong. Are you back with us, Rick? I hit the wrong option.
Yeah, I'm here. When I've ordered a few of these books, from people, and they're, for me, they say American money, right? So that translates into Canadian money, more money, and then you got to add the shipping on top. It's like, and then you got to translate it from American to Canadian, so that's even more money. So a book that costs, somebody in the States, $35 ends up costing me like $80. So I'm like, okay, I don't want to do that. I want to make it easy, just one fee. And from what I got, and I could be wrong, a lot of these people, the money that they're putting in there for their book, right? Like their goal, say 2,000, that's just to get it printed and all that. They don't include the shipping costs in that, as far as I know. I could be wrong. But Indiegogo, when you go and purchase it and you pay the shipping on top of that, they put it towards that goal anyway. So you might as well include it.
Yep.
Unless you've already figured it in. I'm not sure what everybody else does, but maybe I'm assuming a lot on their part.
Well, I think some people have that figured in as far as what their price comes to, but I think it really just depends on the campaign. I know that was when we did ours. That was one of the hardest things to try to figure out was not just try to guess how much is gonna cover the shipping cost, but also think of like the unthought of stuff like packaging materials and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And if I've got something, if it's a weird size, then that changes up what can get shipped out and all that kind of thing. So for us, it was our first time doing something like that, so it was a little bit of guesswork. And I don't know, we'll hopefully ship next month. Well, I'm getting another batch of pages into letter today or tomorrow, so we'll see. But yeah, so hopefully soon. So as the writer, sometimes I get a little nervous with stuff from the artists. I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I know that. I'm not doing the coloring, so and it's Pope Raven's first time, so I'm like, he's not communicating a lot. I'm not sure what's happening with the colors. It's like, ah!
Well, you guys are in the benefit though, where you guys have a really good head start on it. The pencil and ink work's mostly done, so it should be pretty well for you guys to hit that deadline you set for yourself. If it's July, I mean, that's 6 months yet.
Yeah.
So
about 6 months, and as long as I get my money from Indiegogo, I think fairly decently fast, I should be all right. I probably won't. I'm not sure whether I'll bank out right away or not, or I might wait till all the colors are done. It's hard to say whether I bank out right away or wait till all the colors are done. Because that way I don't spend the money. Too easy to do, and I don't want to default on getting things. So I'm probably going to wait till I have the colors and I can start. Well, I'll probably wait till everything's done, and that way it's even more money as it in demand. That I get out. Take it out with, and I'll probably keep it in demand till I get to number 2 done and Snowdrift 1 done.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if if you're friends with Matt Krotz, who did the Curie book, but he bought enough copies over that he's just kept his in-demand store open as a storefront. And so I think he's planning on keeping it open up until the launch date for volume 2.
Yeah. That's something that I'm probably going to do too,
Yep.
I might take away some of the tiers, or perks, depending,
So are you getting where are you getting printed is what I'm trying to say. Is it getting printed there in Canada or what's the plan?
No, I found a place online, Miriam or Myron, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I can probably find the site. I got it bookmarked. Come on. Oh, Maxim, Mixam.
I am not familiar with them, but
they have some pretty good prices. So
cool. Yeah, the place we've worked with in the past is, and we're probably going to go with for our regular books. Our ash cans are getting printed by a small print shop here in town, but our regular books that we're doing are going to be done at a place in Michigan, actually. So, yeah,
cool.
Yeah. So they've Greco. We've worked with them before, and we really like them. But yeah, it's always fun to see where different places people find from. So that's fun. So,
yeah, I was looking at a few places. I looked at Comic Ninja. Or something like Kablam. I think it is too. but those guys were overseas, and I don't mind the overseas thing, but these guys, they're good price, and they're either in the States or Canada. They've got a Canadian site too,
Mm.
or you can switch to Canada, so it might end up getting printed in Canada. I'm not sure where exactly, or somewhere in the States, but then they ship it to you, and it's going to be a decent price.
So yeah, well, good. Well, I really hope that works out for you. Now, on a sort of kind of a bummer of a notice, if you guys don't get to funding, do you have a backup plan, or what's next for you?
Well, my backup plan is most likely I'm thinking about doing it again April 1st as long as I can.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure whether Indiegogo has any rules about you have to wait so long before you redo your campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Because something somebody told me was probably would have been better to come out around tax time. People have more money. So I'm done at the 7th or 8th, depending on where you live. So if it's an extra day, or well, not day, then I wait till the end of the month, April 1st, to relaunch. Hopefully, things will go better and fund faster. So
Mm-hmm.
that's my plans at the moment. And it would give me a longer time to work on Canadian Shield #2 and Snowdrift #1. So, and then there's something too. Maybe I could put Canadian Shield #2 in as well.
Yeah.
But Dillard was saying if it doesn't fund, that he's going to save the Ashcan till when he does his regular Buckler book, his full length Buckler book or graphic novel.
So is Dillard also a Canadian?
No, he's from Los Angeles.
Okay. So
area, I should say, not really.
Right. Somewhere in Southern California. Yeah. So cool. So now we're almost done with the hour here, but I did want to ask, getting back to the story itself a little bit off of the production and the back end and the business and all that kind of stuff. One of the decisions that you made with the book was to make him a Native American, right? Or a Native Canadian.
Hey, American can be North American.
That's true.
Right?
That's true. I guess like the nomenclature in Canada is not something I'd stopped to think about before. I know like Trudeau uses the word First Nations a lot, but I don't know if that's something that's in the parlance. So I have no idea.
I think around here we have the Six Nations. I'm not sure about where the First Nations fit in for Canada. So there's like the Six Nations Reserve, like an hour away from me. So.
Yeah, I'm out in western Nebraska. We have a lot of Lakota Sioux that live locally, and so they just a lot of times they'll use American Indian or just Indian in casual conversation. A Native American is one that gets used a lot too, but not as frequently. But it, different parts of the country vary. I know when I used to live in Oklahoma, and almost nobody said Native American. They either said Cherokee or Creek or whatever their specific tribe was.
Yeah.
They didn't want to be lumped in with people from other tribes because they just that's just how they were. And depending on the individual person, I mean, right? Because not everybody's a monolith, right? But but that up here the community tends to use just Indian or American Indian. But I don't know what it's like in Canada because that's one thing I've never discussed with Canadian.
Well, I think it's the same. There's probably ones that, they have all different views. I've had a lot of Indian friends, throughout the years. And, they're mainly Mohawk tribe.
Okay.
So, I don't really, we don't get into, we've never really got into the politics, I know that they're Native American, but I never discussed that. I've gone out to the reserve for different things with them or whatever. For a funeral or yeah, I think just a funeral, never a wedding. Oh, what's her wedding? I forget. But we just treat each other as human beings. It's the fact that they're Native American means nothing to them, or that I'm white means nothing to them.
Right. And I really think that's in a lot of ways how it should be. That we understand maybe we come from different places culturally, but that doesn't mean that we don't have more in common than not. Everybody needs food. Everybody wears clothes. Everybody wants to be appreciated and loved, however they see that, and I think that's important.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and but yeah, I think it's really cool that you've done this. What was part of your, other than that there wasn't a lot of Christian comics, how do you how do you see putting faith into your book?
Well, like I said, I want it to be something that I thought first and foremost for Christians, and then thought I do want it to be a reach out, a ministry tools, but I know I can't have it over hitting, or I'm not sure what the right word. I know it. I didn't want to be too in your face. It's probably can be a little too much in your face for some people, but I try and low key it. Yeah, he's a Christian, but he's a hero at the same time. It's not the be all. It is the be all and end all for his quote unquote identity, but it isn't at the same time.
All right. So in other words, it's defining, but it's not the entirety.
Yeah, he'll have interests, and I don't know what they all are yet because I'm slowly making it up as I go along. Some of it, as I write issues, defining his personality. He's very, I wouldn't say I'm thinking staunch, but he's a matter of fact. He doesn't. He's a nice guy to be around. You just don't want to piss him off. There's a scene that I was just going over in the 8th comic. He's in a restaurant eating with a friend that he's made, and two guys are fighting over a chair, and he's like, such foolishness over a chair. He comments to his friend, he doesn't get get involved till it gets messy. He figures, and then it's not about being a Christian that he gets involved. It's somebody's done something wrong, and they need to be brought to justice. Okay. Christianity might come out in the fight somehow. God loves you. You don't need to do this or something like that. I'm not sure exactly.
So, yeah. And talking about what are motivations behind the actions we take, not just what the actions are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that can be an important aspect and motivator. I think I was talking last night. Like I said, Doug Ernst invited me onto his channel to interview him about kind of from a Protestant's perspective about his book Soul Finder Demons Match, and which I don't know if you've read, but it's an amazing comic. It's really good.
There's lots of comics out there that I'd love to read. There's probably I would have probably spent $1,000 on the comics out there in the last year, but unfortunately I don't have them.
Yep. I know how that goes entirely, but I've been following Doug's channel for a few years, and when I heard him talk about it, I knew that just had my money. So I made it work on the budget,
Yeah.
I didn't buy other books, so I could buy that book,
Yeah.
But with it, it's of course it's about Catholic priests, and it's about exorcism and all that kind of stuff too. So the faith is very on the top of it. But one of the things that I really appreciate about it too is that it's not like it's some sort of light switch, instant journey, no problems for it. That the characters have a real struggle, and they have difficult things that they have to go through and overcome, and that that the stakes are real, and also at the same time that even though they have that, both of the main character priests have to find strengths within themselves, they also know have to come to the point of realizing that the strength that they have is insufficient, and so they really have to rely on God's strength, because His strength is greater than their strength.
Yeah.
and they don't have access to it without stepping forward and choosing to do what's right, but also that power is outside of their own thing. And I think that's really a difficult thing for us. I mean, of course, in the context of an action story, it's a little different, because our day to day, you're not going to fight giant snake demons in your daily life so much. I mean, in a literal sense anyway. But at the same time, when it comes to being kind to your neighbors, or standing up for truth, or even taking the time out of your day to tell somebody the gospel, you can't do it unless you choose to do it. But the strength to actually go beyond your capacity isn't something that you can just, have access to either. That's what the Spirit is for. So I really appreciated that about it. And I think that when it comes to, not wanting to be too on the nose, but also wanting to be very blatant about what you're doing.
Yeah.
As a writer, that can be a real difficult line to walk, but it definitely can be done.
Yeah. Definitely, and it's probably something I'm going to have to try and do a lot, or my writers are, because eventually I'll be running the whole company and not have time for writing and all that sort of stuff.
Well, thank you, Rick, so much for coming on. I do really appreciate that. I hope that goes well. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to put the link here in the chat again so that people can eyeball that and give it a once over for themselves. I hope that went the right way. Tell me if it doesn't. If somebody wants to try the link and see if it goes there, that'd be swell. Because I pulled it off of Twitter, and they sometimes change the actual URLs, but it just redirects it.
Well, it looks like it went in.
Yeah. So we'll see. Anyway, but yeah, thank you so much for coming on. And if Captain is still available, we'll go ahead and change topics drastically.
Well, thank you for having me on, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Rick. You're free to stick around if you want, or if you got to take off, I understand. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, I got to take off. I got a show on Twitter. I got to do. Not Twitter, Twitch.
Excellent. Well, have a good night, man.
Okay, you too. God bless.
Yes, God bless. So, Captain, can I call you Captain?
Oh yes, that's fine.
I realized as I was driving it, I work and in my job I travel a little bit, and on Thursdays I take a 2-hour drive there and back to where I've got to be. And so I was pulling into Scotts Bluff tonight, and I'm like, I'm not sure what to call him. So, and then I got so busy getting set up tonight, I forgot to ask. That's the kind of thing I think is funny. So, but anyway, Captain, you are, of course, first of all, I'm a big fan. I found your videos that are sadly gone, but back in the day, and you always gave me a chuckle on your comic reviews. And I'm super happy and glad and humbled that you've decided to come on to talk on my show today.
Well, yeah, I'm. Is that my? Do I need to turn this down? I hear you.
I think it sounds okay, but anyway.
Yeah, so this is a school project. I'm a senior history student, and I'm working on my senior thesis. And it's really a pleasure to be able to talk about this, because most of the time, as a history student, you're just reading books that nobody wants to read, and it's really boring. So it's a very personal, boring thing to do.
So why did you choose history as a major, out of curiosity?
Well, when I first started going to school, I was going into media, more journalism, and I found out I hate journalists, and then switched over to history.
So like personally hate journalists, or just like not the profession?
I mean, it's like the whole. I don't really hate the profession, but like, especially on like my campus, it may be different on other campuses, but they're like the most pretentious department. It seems like.
Okay, so a little tidbit of personal history. I studied journalism in college. I didn't finish college because I ran out of money, and and in the middle of going to work and trying to get my debts paid off to the point where I felt it was responsible to go back to school, I met a girl and got married and had children. So I never
The
finished.
normal story.
Yeah. So I now work in mental health, oddly enough, and which I don't know that my time in studying journalism prepared me for that, but other jobs I had along the way did. Um, but the other funny thing about that is writers are always pretentious.
That is true.
And that's one of the things I think is hilarious too. Earlier today I got into a little tiff on Twitter with somebody who I was pointing out somebody being pretentious, and they said, "You're being pretentious," and I said, "Do you think I don't know that?" Of course I am. I'm correcting your grammar. What do you think I'm doing? so yeah, all writers are pretentious. That's just, there's something about when you have the responsibility to convert ideas into words, suddenly you think you know something, and it's the trap we all fall into.
Well, and that's honestly like what all these people that we're about to talk about are as well. They're all very pretentious as well. Originally, I was looking at two different subjects when I was doing my thesis. Though I was going to either look at the censorship in the 1980s, with rock music, and the subliminal messages and stuff like that. But
Right.
I immediately moved to the comic books because when I was going over Wikipedia, I had seen that Frederic Wertham had, been one of the arguments that was used in the desegregation of the schools with the Brown versus the Board of Education. I was like, as a comic book reader, you're always taught, Frederic Wertham's a terrible person.
Right.
And so then you have this humanizing message here. And I was like, what? I want to get down to the issue of, what's going on with all of this? What's the truth?
See, and I've had my questions about Wertham for years. And I'll talk about that just in a little bit. But I don't quite buy the narrative that we've been pitched from the comic industry, and so I'm really interested to. I know you've done some reading. I'm really interested to hear what you had to say. But the other side of it too, drat! I had an idea in my head and it skipped out, and then my battery tells me it needs to charge. So I guess go back to talking, and I'll be right back because I can't remember what I was going to say.
I'll go over some of the scholarly writings that I'm reading, some of the books.
Okay.
Some light reading would be The Blacker the Ink, which is I read the first chapter. It was going over EC Comics and black issues in the books. EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest. That's a pretty good book talking about the progressive stories in EC Comics. I've read Bart Beatty's dissertation, The Frederic Wertham and the Critique of Mass Culture. That's a very pro Frederic Wertham book. Couple other books. Amy Nyberg, Seal of Approval, History of the Comics Code. This gets cited in nearly everything that I've read. So I've read the first chapter. It's really good. And then The 10 Cent Plague. Has a very cool title, but I haven't read it yet.
That is an amazing title. I remember the thing I was going to say. So, like, I have my own reasons for questioning the industry narrative about Wertham. But when I was watching you, was it on John De La Rosa's channel the other day, talking about his about Wertham and being part of the argument for Brown versus the Board of Education, my ears perked up, right? Because one of my hobbies is arguing with people about the philosophy of politics, which is a horrible.
It gets so much into the weeds, you know. Yeah. You're always arguing semantics.
Yeah, exactly. And like, it's a horrible self-destructive hobby, but for some reason I can't get away from it. But of course, like the Brown versus the Board of Education is a seminal philosophical like thing. Like you can't get away from that. And in everything that I'd read and heard about it, I'd not run across Wertham. So the fact that you brought it up was just like, how did I miss this? And that really adds a whole extra layer to the thought process about what's going on with this guy, and how does that relate to everything we've been told about the latter day failings of the comic industry. Because, you know, the other side of it is from, you know, the 90s on, you know, we were told that, you know, comics weren't as big as they ought to be because of the Comics Code Authority, because of the restrictions, and all of that has to do with the straw man created by Frederic Wertham, right? And
yeah,
that doesn't seem to me to be a system that makes sense. Like there's teeth missing in this gear. You know what I'm saying? And you know, as you and I were talking about earlier, you know, comics also were way more popular than they were later, and they were very widespread, and maybe they did have a limited market, but maybe there's other reasons for that, right? So with your thing, tell us a little about, for those in the chat or who watch later who don't know about how what you found about how Frederic Wertham got involved in comics and kind of what his legacy in that is.
Okay, so it goes back again to Black Issues. He started, he's a psychiatrist, and he started a hospital in Harlem, New York, treating Black children. And he treated everybody, but it's Harlem, New York, so it's predominantly Black children. And
when about was this?
I'm not sure when he started the hospital. 40s, maybe 30s.
Okay.
And what he found was the problem children, you know, that he was seeing all read comic books. And in his view, they were greatly affected by these comic books. So I got a good quote here that kind of from the first page. He starts it off, and he has a very good writing style and argumentative. He's very good with rhetoric. So I'll read this paragraph real quick. He starts off the book with, gardening consists largely in protecting plants from blight and weeds. The same is true of attending to the growth of children. If a plant fails to grow properly because attacked by a pest, only a poor gardener would look for the cause in that plant alone. The good gardener would think immediately in terms of general precaution and spray the whole field. But with children, we act like the bad gardener. We often fail to carry out elementary preventative measures, and we look for causes in the individual. So it kind of really, I think that paragraph like explains his worldview. He's not an individualist, you know, he's more of this society's interactions, and we need to change society essentially so we can protect the smaller amount of people.
And it's also really interesting too, because like the terms, the idioms that he's painting are directly out of late 18th century German educational theory, right?
Well, he's German too.
Well, yeah. I mean, and so that's really fascinating, but it's also one of those things where I really like I disagree both on his theory of gardening and how that applies to education. I mean,
that's the whole thing. But you can't deny that writing style and just the way he presents his arguments are very simple.
Mm-hmm.
You can follow it, and it could be convincing to a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely. And there's a poetry to it, and it was that style. The German style school was in vogue, and it from the 1920s on, as the progressive future of what education should be. So it's really not surprising that I was doing a little reading, just really scant, the other day, and that some people had. One of the things that somebody had said about Wertham is that people listened to him just because he had a PhD behind his name. And I thought that was an unfair statement, because it's not just, and even from your quote, that was the thing people thought was the direction. I mean, that was where our educational society was moving at the time. So,
and also it's good to keep in mind, at least from the book, the mass culture one that's talking about his life, there was a lot of cultural critics that criticized him all the time based off his methodology, and his views. Like, they might agreed with him, but they didn't agree with how he came to those conclusions. And a lot of it was he used this thing he called the clinical method.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
He didn't like quantitative. He didn't like the regular, you collect data and that's where you get your information. He wanted it more personal,
Mm-hmm.
and story driven. It seems like in the 70s, when he started talking about television and how bad that was for culture, of course, because that's what you would naturally move to. The sociologists and the more social science people immediately blocked him out, and didn't allow him to really get any sort of headway in that department.
Very, very fascinating. That's awesome. That's incredible stuff. So, of course, he wrote The Seduction of the Innocent, and his assumption was that these children were being damaged because of the comics they were reading.
Well, it wasn't exactly these. It's like he addresses, yes, that a good child, a well-mannered child, won't be greatly affected by a comic. He's arguing that, a very minute portion, the juvenile delinquent, the maladjusted child, will be greatly affected by the comic book. And essentially, he wanted to ban the sale of comics to children, so that if a parent wanted their child to read comics, they would buy it for them. That's basically what he wanted to do.
That's interesting. So, very much a precursor, and it's also interesting too, because this is happening in the late 50s, or in the late 40s, early 50s, and that's the same time the Hays Code was going on in the movie theaters.
Yeah, they talk about that in one of the books.
Yeah, so that's actually, and of course I get in fights every once and again about that too, because some of the best cinema in the world was made under the Hays Code, where people had to be creative with talking about debauchery, and I think that's one of those things that I'm of the opinion that the editorial restraints make better artists, and people that are especially visual artists will get very angry with me for saying things like that. I always believe that that's their laziness coming out. But if you tell an artist you're trying to work with that he's lazy, then he might not show up with your pages. So I don't track that a lot. But yeah, so that's excuse me. So the idea that comics wouldn't be sold to minors. Now, so the that of course is a shocking idea from our modern position, especially those of us who are adult comic patrons, and the idea that somebody telling us, even imagining our child selves being told we wouldn't be allowed to buy something is jarring now that we're used to buying whatever we want. Do you think that that was as significant? Because the other part of the narrative is that this became a huge firestorm within the comic industry at the time. Where, from your reading, is that in fact a valid statement?
Well, and the thing you got to realize too is today we have all sorts of media in our faces all the time. You know, internet, TV, everything. Back then, like, TV was very new. You know, people were just getting TVs in their houses in the 1950s. So people read comic books. Like, it was like 99% of kids read comic books. So, and really, if you really think about it, like, mass culture in Americana was like very, very new at this point as well. Like, you know, you have the what are those called? The pulp magazine, you know, books and things like that go way back, but relatively new to what we have now. Like, everything's just massive and in your face now. But I kind of got off track. What was the question?
So no, so then we have media, mass media becoming and growing and becoming a thing. But at that, 1 second here. Excuse me, sorry, that was a badly timed belch. Anyway, but the idea that Frederic Wertham stepping in and making these suggestions became a national incident, right? And I know that he did speak before Congress in the one.
He spoke the first day, and I think William, Gaines, the EC editor, maybe he was the second day. I'm not sure.
Okay. So, what have you read about?
You'd have to go through the archives, you know, to see that.
Right, stuff. Right. So, did that congressional hearing, was that a huge industry-wide, like, you know, warning bell sort of thing? What was from your reading?
Well,
how did that resound in New York, so to speak?
From what they say about it, I'm going to read the testimonies and all that eventually. Okay. But essentially, people described Wertham as looking very good, sounding very crisp, sounding very smart. And then they talk about, Bill Gaines, the EC owner, sweating, looking nervous, not doing as well. I think his argument was pretty good, but I'm also very different from a lot of people. But so essentially after that, it's like the comics code. The Congress basically, said, do something about this or we'll do something, is essentially like what they stated. And so then they started the comics code. Mm-hmm. And Wertham was very angry about the comics code because he was against censorship. That's why he wanted to ban children from reading comics. The publishers could then still publish what they wanted to, and parents could decide, for their kids if they wanted them to read the books. Which, I mean, sounds like a reasonable argument.
It seems
the
like
comics code then comes in and basically, like, I guess, like, you'd have to go look it up, but I believe it's like 30 publishers joined in with it to decide everything. And out of those 30, like 24 went out of business within like the next few years. Mm-hmm. So, like, they completely censored themselves out of business.
Right. Well, and I think
that gets kind of hazy too, because it says there's essentially like 3 events that very damaged the comic book industry. Basically, television took more people's time, and so less comic books were read.
Right.
The second one is the American News Company, which distributed most of the comic books, was broken up as an antitrust action, and most of the publishers then didn't have a viable alternative to distribute the books, at that time. And then the third one is, oh wait, I read number 3 as number 1. The third one is the anti-comics crusade of Wertham. It's those 3 arguments, and it's like a perfect storm.
Well, and here's part of my question. This is something I've suspected for a while, right? Is that it seems to me, and I'm not sure I'm right, but it seems to me that less is attributable to Wertham, like directly, and the Comics Code, than in the idea that the Comics Code was an excuse to muscle out the competition.
Well, think about it. Like, they immediately went after EC Comics.
Exactly. Right. And EC could have found alternate ways of doing it, or not joining, or the underground.
They were going to
comics
try to
didn't
not
exist
join,
yet.
but they were going to try to not join, but distributors wouldn't use the books unless they had the seal on it. That's how the Comics Code basically strong-armed everybody.
Right. And I think a lot of that probably had to do with I don't know. But this has been something that I've been nourishing in my mind for decades. About 2 decades actually, is the idea that some insider trading, like somebody from National walks over to the distribution company and says, we sell lots of comics. We can find somebody else we can work with. Don't give EC your money. We're gonna. And here's the thing. Here's the trade-off, guy. Right? You're guaranteed to sell our books, and you're guaranteed to sell lots of books because they have the seal, and moms will love this seal. And don't you want to please your mom? So what's losing those? We'll make more than you'll lose with EC because we have the seal, right? That kind of backroom deal seems like the kind of thing. That little mild strong arm thing seems way more likely than some, doctor coming in and telling everybody their comics are bad and parents gasping and pearl clutching in 1950s America. Because the thing is because of the beatniks and the hippies, we have, and I say this looking like me. So, but still, we have this idea that in the 1950s were some sort of terrible era of repression. And while there probably was some of that, at the same time, became wildly popular and like media became, prosperous. And media was expanding, and all kinds of ideas were getting spread out, and people were living, fulfilling happy lives in the 50s, just like they were later. It wasn't like it was some, dark Pleasantville, thing. I don't know if you saw the movie Pleasantville, but.
Yes, I see it.
Yeah, and it makes.
Well, you think about it. The 1950s, everybody comes in back from war. They're making good money. They're starting families. They're eating cheeseburgers. The cheeseburger gets started.
Oh man!
Everything's booming. And then we come into the 1960s, which is huge and booming as well. It was a great time in America at those points.
Right.
With all the problems that they had.
Right, and a lot of the problems I think they had were we never finished dealing with the Civil War, and I think I think we suffered a lot of negative consequences for letting that happen. And I don't want to get too much in the politics of all of that. I think some of the problems that we hadn't dealt with had to do with the fact that war just is terrible, and we were just discovering how detrimental that kind of thing is. And I think the media also was just starting to make things look worse than they were. I learned in my early 30s how we were lied. My entire childhood, I was lied to about Korea. I was lied to about Vietnam. That's our original guest, Six Scale Combat, has written that comic Napalm Brothers, and he's done a lot of deep dive studying into Vietnam.
I took a class last semester on Vietnam. It's just wild.
Yeah, and I'm super excited to have him on, but provided he gets over, he DM'd me earlier, and he's like, I think I may be my country's first death to the coronavirus. And I was like, oh my God, don't die. I was like, you have to come on my show. But seriously, it's one of those things where the media has been lying to us for so long that I really, once again, I think that like things were, I have to believe things were more stable in the 50s and 60s than we've been led to believe. And if society is more stable, then have to be other reasons than just this panic that causes problems in comics, you know.
I think part of the problem and the hysteria, because you've seen it in a lot of stuff with rock and roll and Elvis Presley, and a lot of this stuff was some of the stuff that I've seen in this particular with comics, though, like it's the mass consumerism, and people felt dealing with World War II, just having dealt with World War II, and you're dealing with communism and fascism. People felt that this mass consumerism with all this violence and stuff, that America would succumb to the same sort of stuff that happened in Germany, you know, that happened in Russia. And they didn't want that to happen. And they felt that, you know, big government was the answer to fix those problems.
Well, I think the other thing too, the idea that this actually comes back to, this might be a stretch though. But the one of the things that you had in you know, in communist China, one of the things that you had in pre-war Germany, all the propaganda and the state-run Pravda, and comics were privately run. You know, it was a censor board that was run by themselves. So the government had their hand out of it, and maybe that was a thing where, you know, people felt a little more secure about it. I've often thought that, you know, it's better to censor yourselves and your friends than to have the government come in and censor you, right? And if it's something where you're going to agree to work together in a particular market, then you can agree to a certain set of standards, without it being something that's detrimental to art, right? And so I've always thought the Comics Code Authority had a certain it's better than telling the government telling you what you can't say on television, to just not say things on television, you know. Because, you know, you don't, rather than because you have somebody telling you. So Wertham, of course, was very critical, and he thought he in the book, I know he mentioned that in Seduction of the Innocent, that he felt there were what do you call it, subliminal messages being told, and programming kids through the stories to act in deviant fashions and saying scandalous things about.
Yeah, I understand. I can kind of explain that. So it's like, you know, with art, there's subjective ways to read something. And so a lot of his critics say that, you know, that he would read the stories and not get the real message, or he would not take them in context. One is like the whipping from EC Comics, which uses racial slurs multiple times in the story, but it's an anti-racist story. So it's like Huckleberry Finn. It uses, you know, racial slurs all the time in the book.
Yep.
But it has an anti-racist message. It's like that. But he read him, and, you know, he's coming from the perspective of somebody that might not understand the context, and is saying, you know, because it says these bad words, then it's inherently bad.
Right.
And it's like, well, I don't agree with that. But when you think that, you know, Wertham's really a postmodernist in the ilk of like the Frankfurt School, if anybody knows what that is. You know, the one thing to say about postmodernists is they hate labeling anything. So even calling them a postmodernist, they would get angry with you if you do that. I've had that happen in college.
Yeah, because at that point you've shoehorned them into an objective truth, and there's no such thing as objective truth.
Yeah, essentially their philosophy is very metaphysical in the aspect that they don't believe in science as data that can explain the world all the time. You really see that in like Wertham's clinical process, because he wants to take it very personally, and he doesn't want to include lots of data, because I don't exactly know. I'm not a postmodernist, and it confuses me. But
well, I think part of it is you have the power of the narrative versus the power of the research, because we're not. And I think it's true. It's true that you can't label everything scientifically, because there are some things that are beyond. I think science is limited to the physical
There's some
world
things that we haven't explained yet.
Yeah, and there's also things that, like, music touching the soul isn't something that science can tell you. The truths of beauty aren't something science can tell you, although science can point to exactly what features we universally find beautiful and create a face that everybody likes, but that doesn't necessarily explain why. But that's a that's a whole different thing. But yeah, I think but with it at the same time, I think that the part of the reason that this, and I think that postmodernists shoo away from hard sciences even today, and in favor of soft sciences, is because of this singular idea that there is no universal truth, that there's no ultimate truth. And I think that's crazy. I just because we can't know that it's out there doesn't mean that it's not out there, So
there's here's one thing so this stuck out to me. Wertham suggested that the history of the world could be written in terms of the ways with societies dealt with murders, which kind of made me think about Michael Foucault, who's another postmodernist. That he wrote Madness and Civilization, which is the idea that people live like they're being watched all the time, and that's why they do good things, which I think is a very interesting theory, but I don't really know if I agree with that. And he also said this. Here's a quote from Wertham. Even though we live in a violent period, I am certain that the ways of violence will be replaced by reason. So it's this this is like the idea of the utopian future, like a Marxist idea, but instead of resources, it's the idea of murder, exchange.
Well, and I think it's really interesting too, because I actually was in a conversation earlier this week with this, where people juxtaposed reason and violence, as though that there can never be a reason for violence. That's one of those things that I found fascinating, because those aren't really opposites. They're not mutually exclusive concepts at all. If somebody wants something from you that they choose to take, they may use violence to get it, and then that's a reason for violence. It may not be a just reason, but that's a different question, right? At the same way, you may use violence to defend yourself against somebody taking your stuff or against harming your person. And that's a reason to use violence. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, but postmodernists and tend to, and maybe not as a whole, but many of them that I've spoken with hold these two ideas as mutually exclusive when they're not. And that's one thing I find fascinating.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So this idea that and I think that comes down to this. One of the other fundamental questions is, are people basically good or not, right? It's in terms of a moral sense, not in terms of a worth sense, because that's a different question altogether too. And I think that because obviously I think Wertham would assume that all people were both. From what I've read, I think he would assume that they were morally good by nature and worthy by nature, but they are being corrupted by their environment and their physical inputs. So,
well, he would say that as well. He definitely stated multiple times that comic books were one of the contributing factors to this juvenile delinquency that is thrown around all the time.
It's also really interesting too, because from him writing this in the late 40s and the 50s, was that the idea of the juvenile was a fairly new one at that point. The idea of adolescence wasn't really invented until the late 1890s or the late 1880s, I think.
Well, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah. Because prior to that, there was just children and adults, and different societies had different ideas of when you became an adult.
Is that a Freud thing?
What?
Is that a Freud thing?
I can't remember. My boss was talking about that Okay, so I work with teenagers, but our executive director at my agency used to be my program director at another agency where we were in the youth services department, and so he'd actually done a lot of research into adolescent theory and development for the purpose of writing grants and stuff. And I cannot remember who the fellow was. I don't think it was Freud, but I can't remember who the fellow was that came up with the idea of the adolescent. But a big part of it was because in the late part of the Industrial Revolution, you had all these late teens and early 20-somethings that there weren't farm jobs for them to do. So they moved to the city to try to get factory work. And in some cities, there wasn't enough factory work, or they were in the middle of a strike or whatever. And so these young men were just roaming aimlessly around cities, causing troubles and, and getting into things. And so this whole idea of adolescent behavior became something that psychologists started describing, because all of these bored teenage guys were getting into trouble because they didn't have anything else to do. And that defined the 20th century. So yeah. Everything from that to Rebel Without a Cause to the Wild Bunch to what was that movie with Dennis Hopper and the motorcycle movie?
Or even the movie where they get Saturday School or whatever. What is that one in the 80s?
Yeah. Breakfast Club.
Breakfast Club, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and every generation repeats the story of the wayward youth, because teen culture is a thing. When 100 years before that, these kids were working the farms and having babies and all that kind of stuff, and some of them were going
adults very quickly.
Yeah, when you think about the difference between like Rebel Without a Cause versus like the opposite story, Anne of Green Gables, right? Where Anne was in a very similar position, the girl version in Canada, but she goes from being a child to an adult in the course of a book. And Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean has no reason to do anything, and and doesn't want one, and that's that part of that whole thing. That I just find that is really interesting to how that predominant idea obviously played into Wertham's concepts about how comics can destroy people. Quote. I don't agree with him.
Well, and one thing to keep in mind, though, is he's the most polarizing. He's the comic book boogeyman.
Right.
But he's not really the one that started like the anti-comics movement.
Okay.
I can't remember what the guy's name is off the top of my head right now, but Sterling Northern, I think, is his name. He's the one that's like, he wrote the first like anti-comics article in the early 40s or something like that. And there's many people that were in this sort of movement, teachers, librarians, other people like that felt that reading comics were less than books because they had pictures. Mm-hmm. And it's funny the way they talk about it, because it's like you look at a Golden Age comic book and that thing is smashed with all kinds of there's lots of exposition and dialogue all over it. It'll take you forever to read a Golden Age comic book.
Well, I have a reprint.
Imagine if they saw like today's comic book that has like you can read in 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, I have a reprint edition of Batman 27. I mean, of Detective 27, mm-hmm. The first appearance of Batman, and it has a full chapter of the pulp novel, the Castle of Fu Manchu, mm-hmm. in it, illustrated. But I think it's all of the text of that chapter. And I read through it. It probably took me, because it's so wordy and like dense, it probably took me 2 hours to read that. And of course, it's been shrunk down into our modern comic size, so all the words are really tiny too.
Oh, that would be terrible.
It's not the worst thing ever.
Yeah, it's really interesting because kids used. They talk about the kid culture, and this was like a whole thing comic books were like basically a currency for children. They would trade them, they would pay people to do stuff with them. And so it was very much like a big thing. And, you know, when something is huge in some sort of cultural aspect, you're going to have people that try to, you know, do something with it in some sort of way. You know, you had the anti-comics. There was one woman that actually worked at Wertham's hospital, and she was actually pro-comics, which I think was really interesting. Her last quote from hers, I got this from the Alter Ego, you know, edited by Roy Thomas.
Oh yeah, Roy Thomas. He's a hero of mine.
Yeah, mine too. Anyways, she wrote the comics may be said to offer the same kind of mental catharsis that Aristotle claimed was an attribute of the drama. She was basically saying that the children that she saw, they usually got comforted by reading these comic book stories. That was her attachment. She worked at the same hospital that Frank Wertham, you know, started. So it was like a counter on that point. Her name was Dr. Laureate Bender.
Man, that's an interesting idea. Now, I think I intrinsically have agreed with that growing up reading comics, but I don't think I've ever thought of it in those words before, that in those terms before. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I saw the Aristotle and I was like, I gotta save that as a quote. Maybe
Yeah,
for my paper.
that's nice. I like that. So now here and Wertham, of course, was against censorship. He thought comics could do danger to people who were already in bad places.
Because he was against fascism. He was very much against fascism, so he was against censorship. So
the idea of the government control keeps you from doing anything would be abhorrent to him.
Even though he's a progressive, it's sort of weird, but
well, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, no, I get that, and there's a wide sweep of some of that stuff. But yes, the idea of the social controls should be enough to keep kids on the straight and narrow, according to Wertham. As long as they don't have access to those damn comics. And so then the other thing that's fascinating, and this is something that I've known about for about 20 years about that, but I used to be, let me tell you a little background on this. I used to be a staff writer at the online fan magazine called Fanzing, which was a DC Comics fan magazine that was an online thing that ran for several years. And its last run of production was 2002, 2001. And for the last year, I was a staff writer for them, and I wrote fiction pieces for the story for the thing. And I also wrote some articles. And nearly everything's on the Internet Archive now. The site's down, though. I don't know what's up with that, but because it had just been up for a long time, but the editor-in-chief may have decided that he just didn't have the money to keep paying for the internet bills. I don't know. But they're up on the Internet Archive if you want to check this stuff out. But I thought it was an article on that page, but it may have been in our chat, in our staff chat room. But I was talking to a guy who was familiar with this fact that even though Wertham was very anti comic book in the way that he was, in the 70s, he became fascinated with the fanzine culture and the fan culture. I know you've read some about it, so let's talk about that.
Yeah, I have the book right here. I got it from the library. It's called The World of Fanzines by Frederic Wertham. And essentially, let's see if I got the page. I forgot to. Anyways, his basic argument for this book was fanzines were a very good way of allowing society to communicate with one another. He's very fascinated with how society communicates and works with one another, and he felt that fanzines were a very positive, thing in this. It's written mainly as like an anthropological or just a histography sort of way with it. It's pretty good. I would say it has
So
like a list of editors and publications that he admits he probably doesn't have all of them, but it's good for what it is.
well, yeah, I mean, think about it. Like the fanzines started, just kids, using their school's mimeograph machines to
Mm-hmm.
to make their own magazines and sell them at 5 and dimes and stuff. And that's one of the things that's fascinating too. And of course, Alter Ego was one of the most successful fanzines, and they're still around, right? Thomas is still publishing
And
that, right?
I noticed the other day you can look up their magazines on the internet. They have them all archived there, and you can read them.
Wow.
I was like, holy cow, this is awesome.
And of course,
this is like a researcher's dream here,
And of course, Roy Thomas started as reading comics as a kid, getting involved in the fanzine thing, and ended up becoming editor-in-chief at Marvel for a spell. And his work in All-Star Squadron for DC was foundational in a lot of my writing, in terms of building universes and what the idea is for the Ideal Comics universe that my buddy Chris and I developed back starting in actually 2003, and that I'm still writing on our little web comic today. So like, yeah, his stuff is super important to me. And so the idea that when I discovered that Wertham, who was, had all these horrible things to say about Batman, was suddenly like enamored with the idea that fans of the things that he didn't like could also come together and share their love and write about it and talk about what they thought was good or bad. That was a revelation to me in a way that made me really question how much could he hate comics, because I was always told he hated comics. How much could he hate comics if he was so much in favor of fans talking about comics and sci-fi and movies and that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and he was like 70 something when he published that book. His Paramount, Seduction of the Innocent, his huge book though, he was like 50 something. So like huge career before that. If he had never published Seduction of the Innocent, he would be seen as like a grand champion probably with his work, building a free clinic. Well, it wasn't free. It was like they paid like 5 cents to get psychiatric care. He basically said they needed to pay something to feel like the care they're getting is worth something.
Yeah. That's a real damn thing too. So being in the field, I'll tell you that means something. Wow. So cool. That's crazy. So, and of course now he took his fanzine book and he went to San Diego, I heard, right?
That's what I hear. I haven't really explored that yet. I mean, if there's videos or something, I would love to watch them.
Yeah.
But apparently he went to go speak at San Diego Comic-Con and got heckled, and he basically just left. Sort of never talked about comics again, I guess, is the story.
Yeah, well, that's a rough one. And that makes me really wonder, like, like I said, I question, and I of course you're still in the middle of some of your research, but I question how much of an impact he actually had versus how much it was sold that he had the impact to make way for, what I suspect may have been some crooked dealing on behalf of some of those old publishing guys. Because like, I don't know if you've ever done much looking like Martin Goodman, who used to be the editor of Marvel. He was a little scabby, and
well, yeah. Just think about this for a second. So you got Martin Goodman, who we know the whole thing about Marvel and creators' rights. We know about National Comics, screwing out Siegel. and Superman, Batman and his rights fiasco. You got some crooked stuff going on, and now you have Frederic Wertham, who's commenting on these people, and they already are, very crooked people. It's documented. And here's what I liked this sentence. I think it sums it up. So, comic book fans despise Wertham for his conclusions. But basically, he was one man operating out of a free clinic in Harlem, facing a multi-million-dollar a year industry organization that hired private detectives to tail him and intimidate his staff. Yet the comic book fans, cultural commentators, and social scientists have sought to portray Wertham as a reckless destroyer of a powerless cottage industry.
Holy crow.
That kind of sums it up. And all he wanted to do was say, hey, if parents want kids to have comics, they can buy them comics. Like, that's basically what it's like. That sounds reasonable, in my opinion.
I agree. And I don't agree with his assumption with that either, but it's not like, burn all your Beatles records because, John Lennon said something distasteful, which that's a whole different story too. But I could talk for a long time about John Lennon. But the point is it's not even in the same ballpark as that, but at the same time, like I don't agree with him, but I can see where he's coming from, and it's not necessarily a bad place. And it's really how despised the guy is doesn't seem to be consistent with what he said, and
well, it's almost like instead of wanting to learn more about him and what it's all about, you just hate, and it kind of goes with his message. He said, if there's communication, there won't be violence, and it's like that's kind of true. I wanted to point this out though. Robert Crumb, I think, actually got him, because this note said Robert Crumb took Wertham's labeling to heart, and on Zap number 1, it says fair warning for adult intellectuals only.
And see, that's another interesting point too about comics distribution, and we talked about that a little bit off air, or I mean in chats earlier. But is that the whole comics movement, the underground comics movement from the 60s and 70s, wasn't hindered, at all by the Comics Code Authority. In fact, without the Comics Code Authority, some of these creators may not have been able to pursue the kind of careers they had. And goodness sake, Zippy the Pinhead was in Sunday Funnies when I was a kid. You know what I mean? And that couldn't have existed if the Comics Code Authority had been there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also
he makes a clear distinction between newspaper strips though and comic books.
Yeah.
In his opinion, comic strips are directed at adults because it's in the newspaper. And he says there is like regulations in those, but there wasn't in comic books.
Yeah. But
so
my point with that mostly is that I can't remember the guy's name, but the guy who created Zippy the Pinhead wouldn't have been part of the the underground movement if there hadn't been an underground movement, and there couldn't have been an underground movement without the Comics Code Authority.
Well, the 1970s was huge in counterculture anyways.
Yeah, that's true. So maybe my assumption is wrong.
I don't know, but like everything was just crazy about the 70s.
Yeah, that's fair enough. The other thing that I know we're getting close to the top of the hour again here, but the other thing I wanted to talk about too is, and this is from our chat earlier today, is one of the big things that got lobbed around a lot when I was first getting into comics in the 90s. Was that comics would be everywhere just like they are in Japan if it wasn't for the Comics Code Authority. If it wasn't for this regulation, then everybody could have the comics that they wanted all the time, and it would be just like Japan or just like France. But here it's just kids stuff, and it's that darn Comics Code Authority's fault. Darn you, Frederic Wertham. And that was the narrative that I was pitched, right?
Yeah.
For why I was the only kid in my school that read comics. And I don't buy that either.
No, I mean, we talked about it. I think part of it is, the price of comics goes up and up and up. And a lot of the times they're like, oh, we're selling less comics, so we're going to raise the price so we can keep the same profits. It's like, okay, but that's just going to shrink your audience even smaller. And then it's also, they're in a comic store. And a lot of the times comic stores aren't very inviting.
So the first time I went to a comic shop, I was 12. Maybe I was even 11, and my parents took me to a comic shop in Rapid City. And of course, it's got, large-breasted women and tiny bits of cloth on the walls, and the Image had just recently come out, so there was some the guts and the gore and that kind of stuff was the thing, and my mom's eyes got like this. And I was just like little Matthew's, like, where are the Batman comics? And the whole time, like my parents were just nervous as hell. And I don't know that my father ever went with me to a comic shop again because he was so uncomfortable. And I mean, my dad's kind of a nervous guy anyway, so that's kind of a thing. But it was one of the things. Yeah, comic shops aren't necessarily welcoming, especially to new readers, especially to young readers. And I do think that the fact that they're not in the newsstands anymore, that the price point's high is a factor. But even that goes back to the 50s, like you were talking about, where the distribution network got split up, and then they had to spend decades rebuilding the distribution network. But by the time the Silver Age happened, the DC Silver Age, Marvel Silver Age, the whole Marvel Age thing, Charlton became in, and we had these new publishers that sprung up. And comics became a big enough issue that it kind of defined a generation, right? With the whole Marvel Age. So
I think the Marvel Revolution, and what's weird about if you read the Slugfest book, he even states that in the early days with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby creating that universe, they were being distributed by a company that was owned by DC.
Wow. That's that.
So it's really interesting. That's why what is it, Tales of Suspense and all those early titles that had two different characters. You'd have a Cap story and an Iron Man story.
Mm-hmm.
It was because they would DC would only let them distribute so many books. So they were like, okay, we'll split them into two. You'll get 8 pages. 2 characters.
Okay. Wow. That I did not know either. That's fascinating. But that once again talks about the whole, monopolistic aspect that I suspect was going on behind the scenes in the 50s.
And we got it now today with Diamond,
Oh yeah. Don't even get me started talking about Diamond. My goodness sakes.
Nobody likes Diamond.
That's a whole thing. Well, not just that I disliked them, but I mean, you go back to the 90s, and that's when some of those shenanigans started happening. And collapsing distribution networks are part of what killed newsstand sales and keep them killed today, because there was enough competition to keep them afloat, and a lot of that went with Marvel going exclusive in the early 2000s. But so I think that's a factor too. But one of the interesting things about the popularity of comics in the mid-century too, and I mentioned this earlier. DC had their huge implosion in the mid to late 70s, where they ended up axing a bunch of their titles because there was a recession and started hitting them really bad. But when you think about the fact they had an implosion, was because they were out on a limb because there was that much demand at one point, and they overestimated demand and they underestimated inflation.
Yeah, it's the same thing that happened in the 90s as well.
Yeah. But I mean, there was a strong enough market to justify that gamble that led to them failing. That's a market of success. It's just not the best business in that market. And I was, once again, as 17-year-old Matthew reading the letter columns in the back of Detective Comics, I was told that it was the fault of the other guy. It was this Frederic Wertham's fault, that it was the Comics Code Authority's fault, that it was the the man's fault, when it's not even a bad thing. It's just business. And, and that's at least that's my take on it. And I think that as comic fans in the 2020s, as I know I'm working on projects and trying to find markets, and I have been for a long time, that changes the way I want to look at distribution, that changes the way I want to look at marketing, because I think we've been given bad messaging in all of that kind of stuff, and we need to if we're going to be economic parties, then I think we need to change the way we look at that paradigm, as instead of just what the narratives we were given. That's part of my take on it anyway. So, well, we are at 9:00. And Captain, I want to thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real honor. And I tell you what, if you get through your senior project and you've had any more revelations and you feel like you want to come back on, let me know. I'd love to have you back if you've had fun.
Well, I mean, it's fun to, talk about the stuff that you just have mulling on in your head. I've obviously taken a lot of notes. And I haven't started really writing anything yet, but I've just been taking it all in, and it's good to voice it out and make some sort of sense of what's going on.
So yeah, that's an important part of the process. I think it's fun too, in that because then you get to know whether the ideas that you have in your mind actually make sense. If somebody else can go with you.
Oh yeah, and you got to be able to vocalize it, because sometimes you just think and you're like, oh yeah, that sounds great, and then you write it down and you read it and you're like, no, that's stupid.
That was the dumbest thing I've ever written. I don't know why I did that. So you just blame Frederic Wertham. That's what you do. That's the go-to with that. So well, anyway, again, thanks for coming on, guys. The chat, thanks for joining in. I put Metal's comment up on the screen earlier, and I do agree that he said that if we don't get comics back on the newsstand, then we're never going to get that mass market saturation like we had in the past. And I think that's definitely a valid concern, because they can't stay in the comic shop anyway. Newsstand system we have is pretty broken too, and because of the ingrained competition, and there's a lot of weird preferential treatment that goes on with it. But at the same time, we've got to come up with something, because I don't know what the answer is, but it's definitely not the current and past systems that we've had. Yep. And the comic shop.
There's a reason Amazon, is so big, and it's because they've seen the future and they've moved towards it. And
that
other industries have.
That direct to consumer aspect that Amazon offers is a big factor, and I think that's what you got. I think that's the way forward in some way or another. But it also has to deal with they deal with aggregation, and they deal with being a marketplace for a bunch of other small businesses. And I think that's if it wasn't for the fact that they were really usurious with the way they charge for small item shopping, because that's the other aspect too, is like John De La Rose has got some really great products available on Amazon, but their price point's beyond what I'm willing to pay for what I get. I'm not saying that it's bad. From his concepts are awesome, but $4 plus shipping for a 24-page comic. That's not. I'm not going to do that. I'm just not. I can buy 3 Alterna books that I know I like, because I'm already getting them for that money, or I can save them up and give them to my artist.
I think that they're trying to emphasize then the digital market. And it's like,
yep.
You don't want to even get into the digital market because nobody likes it.
Yeah, well, and I think there's a lot to be said for the digital market, but I don't think it's the end all answer.
No.
It's like, they
People still like reading tangible books,
yeah, and it's the
stuff.
same with
I
with
hate
music.
reading a
Like,
book on the computer because I got to sit in front of the computer,
well,
or
it's like,
with this
yeah.
device, and read.
Well, and it's like, we have digital music, right? But Walmart sells records again. So people are buying vinyl for $25 a pop, right?
They like the tangible item.
They like the tangible item. They like the fact they can go home, they can put it on the hi-fi, and they can listen to it just like it was intended to be, because that's how you listen to the Bee Gees, man. Or whatever. So, okay. I am going to go ahead and wrap up. Thanks so much again, Captain, for coming on, and chat for participating. If you guys want to check out Captain Cummings' content more, you can't, because he doesn't do much. No, he is around. He's on JDA's show a lot. He has really fun things to say when he is, and I enjoy it very much. But yeah. And that's I guess that's the show. Also, don't forget Cross Comics, Canadian Shield. If you're interested, check it out. He was fun to talk to too. So, but yeah, that's the show, guys. Thanks for tuning in. And next week, I've got #1 Marmaduke fan and Matt Krotz coming back to talk about My Hero Academia and Japanese superheroes. So we're coming. It's interesting too so. Well, I'm very excited about that, but that's it for today. So thanks for tuning in, guys. Bye.